And over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about dealing with messes in our lives and how we deal with mess. And tonight, it's entitled Messier, as in and so we're going to be talking about messier and messier. You know, one of the things that when I was studying for this, it made me think of something that happened to me when I was a lot younger. I was working at a grocery store. I mean a lot younger. I was like in high school. And I remember bumping into a shelf, and on that shelf were bottles of ragu. And one of the bottles spilt and hit the ground and shattered, and ragu sauce went everywhere. Got on all the other bottles, it got on the floor, it got on the customers. And so we raced in to clean it up. And as we're cleaning it up, they're reaching up to the top, and the other person, as they're trying to clean it up, of course, they ended up knocking more stuff off the shelf until the harder we tried to clean it, the messier it got, and the worse it got. And the messier and messier and messier. And eventually, I mean, we ended up with about 4 or 5 broken bottles of the big giant jars of ragu spaghetti sauce. And it just seems like every time we tried to clean up the mess, we just made it worse. I had a buddy of mine who bought paint, and his wife, they stacked it on a shelf in the garage. And the shelf gave way one day, and he went walking out there, and the paint had hit the ground and exploded. And the paint everywhere. And the longer he tried to clean it up, it seemed like he just... You know what they ended up having to do was take everything out of the garage and use that paint to paint the floors and the walls and everything, because they couldn't clean the mess. Because every time I clean it, they just made it worse. And sometimes we end up in that situation where we make a mess, and when we try to address it, we try to fix it, we end up making it worse. And physically that's one thing. I mean, you make a mess worse, eventually you'll reach the end of it. But what happens when you have a financial mess and you try to manipulate the situation to make it better? For instance, you're in debt, you're struggling financially, and so what you do is you take out a loan and you borrow money, and you end up making it worse because you dig a deeper hole, and you end up to the point where you end up losing everything because you spent so much energy trying to manipulate the situation so that you could get out of it, and you're trying to fix it. Or you've had a problem in your marriage and you just end up making it worse and worse every time you try to hide it and try to keep it and try to fix it, instead of submitting and saying, hey, I've hurt you, or I've done this, and seek forgiveness. You take a professional mess or an academic mess, you get caught, you're behind on your grades, and so you fib to your teacher, and you end up telling them that something's happened and you need extra time, so they give you extra time, and then the next time you get into a deadline, you've lost that ability. You don't have a problem lying to them, and so you go back and do it again. When you make a mess messier, it just gets messier, right? And here's the reason we make messes messier, is that we're going to talk about it today. In fact, if you're not a church person, a religious person, this is true for all of us. Every mess that you make and every mess that you're involved in, whether you marry into a mess, you dated your way into a mess, or you inherited a mess, every mess comes with bad options. Every mess comes with some bad options. You borrow more, lie bigger, destroy the evidence, hide, make up a story and another text and make it sound like the first text really wasn't meant for them at all. There are always some really bad options that come with every mess, and those bad options essentially just make it worse. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about ER, because I want to save you from ER, all right? Not emergency room, but messier. Some messes, they're unavoidable. You walk into them and there's no way out of them. And if you're in the middle of a mess, there's no way to go back and unmake the mess. But with the mess you're currently facing, whether it's relational, financial, academic, professional, whatever it might be, there are some really bad options that come with that mess that you are being tempted, like we all are tempted, to opt for something that's going to make your mess messier. And to talk about how to avoid making a mess messier, I want to tell you one of my favorite stories from the Old Testament. If you have a Bible and follow along, this is from 1 Samuel chapter 34, or chapter 24, excuse me. Many of you, if you grew up in church, you're probably familiar with some of this story, and your mind may race to the end, but hopefully you can just track with us through this story, okay? It's a story that takes place at about 1000 BC. It's the story of David before he becomes the king. And the story actually begins with David was a little boy, and because you may know, one day the prophet Samuel shows up. Now, you got to understand, Saul had done something as king, and God told him that he had taken the mantle away from him. And so God sends out Samuel to crown to anoint a new king. Now, Saul already knows this is coming, but, he doesn't know who it's going to be, and he doesn't know how long it's going to take. He just knows that he violated God's law, and as a leader, God wasn't going to leave him in place. Leaders are held to a higher standard as far as God is concerned. So Samuel goes around, and he ends up naming, he goes to the sons of Jesse, and he names the youngest son, David, as the next king. And so David was anointed the king of Israel when he was a little boy, but the problem was, he was just a little shepherd boy, okay? And Israel already had a king. Israel had King Saul. And so now they had two kings. They had the grown-up adult king, Saul, and they had the little shepherd boy who was going to be king. And he said, okay, thank you, I'm anointed, and he went back to tending his sheep. Well, as time went by, David made himself known in the community. One day, he went, as you know, he went and visited his brothers who were serving in the army of Israel. They were fighting the Philistines, and every day Goliath would come out and challenge the champion of Israel to come out and fight him, and whoever won, he would let if the Israelites beat him, if whoever champion was came out and built Goliath, then the Philistines would surrender and the war would be over. If the Philistines won, then Israel would surrender and the war would be over. And now Goliath was probably a giant, and now you're saying, well, but I'm not talking about 30, 40 feet tall guys. I'm talking about probably the same size as some of the professional basketball players, maybe 8, 9 feet. And David and Goliath wasn't alone. He had 3 brothers, and we found historical evidence of them, not just in Scripture, but also in the archaeological evidence from where the Philistines were. They were a family of relatively gigantic proportions, and Goliath was probably between 7.5 to 8.5 feet tall. And the Israelites were probably about between 5, maybe 5'5" at the most. So you're talking about a huge difference. And Goliath was a professional soldier, and he was armed, and so he was coming out and challenging these guys. And so David gets out there, and David, who trusts in the Lord, gets sent there, and he ends up killing the giant. Kills Goliath. And then when David killed Goliath, he became like a overnight rock star, right? Everybody knew David's name because he had killed Goliath in front of the entire army, and the Philistines had surrendered and gone away, and everybody was talking about David, and not many people were talking about King Saul. In fact, Samuel, who wrote this story for us, says, in everything he did, talking about David, he had great success. In fact, one of the chants to the people when he walked the street, here's King Saul who's killed his thousands, but here is David who's killed his tens of thousands. And so Saul got jealous of David, and he was afraid of him. But all of Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. And it's an interesting idea that people who lead are perceived as the leaders, whether they have the title or not. And King Saul had the title, but David was the one who had stepped out in front, who was the actual leader. Yeah, I'm sorry, Ima. I apologize. Hang on a second. Let me give Ima a note card. Okay, no problem, Ima. Here we go. So anyway, I'm sorry. Sorry about that, Ima. I didn't mean to leave you out. So what we got here is Saul begins to get jealous. And so, and the people are thinking this is the leader of the army and perhaps the leader of the nation, and they're thinking maybe this guy will make a good king. And so Saul realizes he has a problem on his hands, and so he comes up with a way to try to control David to keep things from getting any worse. So he decides he's going to marry one of his daughters off to David, because if he can make David his son-in-law, perhaps he'll be able to control him that way. So he goes to David and says, I would love for you to be married into my family, and I'll be your father-in-law. And David responds like this. He says, Oh, King Saul, what an honor, but I am a lowly shepherd boy from a family that's not very important. I'm not worthy of the honor to marry one of your daughters. Well, word of this gets out, and the next thing you know, it's Maximus the Merciful. No, it's David the Humble. David the Humble. Can you believe David was so humble that he gave up an opportunity to be part of the king's family? Well, things continue to go, and David gets more and more popular, and Saul is more and more jealous. And then one of Saul's daughters fell in love with David. So he thought, I'll try again. And apparently David had it for this daughter as well, because when he goes to David this time, he says, would you marry the daughter? And David says, I'll marry your daughter. And Saul says, oh, well, the bride price for my daughter is not an amount of money. It's not herds. It's not oxen. The price for my daughter is 100 dead Philistines. You have to kill 100 Philistines in order to marry my daughter. And Saul said to himself, I'm not going to raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do it, right? It's perfect. David goes out. He's got to kill 100 people, 100 members of the enemy. He'll never do it. They'll slaughter him. And I'll be done with him. I'll be rid of him. David and his men go out, and they kill 200 Philistines, and they brought back the evidence. Well, that made things even worse. In fact, Samuel tells us when Saul realized the Lord was with David, and that his daughter Michal was actually loved David, which meant Saul was not going to be able to manipulate his daughter to control David, Saul became even more afraid of David, and he remained his enemy for the rest of his life. Now, here's the connection between all that and address the mess. Okay, David has a big mess on his hand, and here's the unique thing, and here's why it's so relevant to us. David has a big mess on his hands, and it's not his fault. It's not like the messes I make or the messes that you make sometimes. He didn't ask to be king. The whole Goliath thing, he didn't. He was just serving his country. He was just trying to help. The whole lead out in the campaign things, he's just trying to do what people asked him to do. He's trying to serve the Lord. He refused the king's daughter's hand, but no matter what he does, things get worse and worse and worse, and the mess gets worse and bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally, things escalate to where one afternoon, Saul completely loses it, and he throws a spear and tries to kill David in the palace. And David leaves the palace, runs for his life, heads out in the desert, and from that point on, Saul tried to kill David. He kept trying to hunt him. He put a note on his hand. He made lies up about him. And he wanted his son Jonathan to be the next king. And as long as David was alive, he was a threat to Jonathan. And David leaves the city, and when David goes out of the wilderness, basically in hide, he gathers around him all these of Saul's enemies, all these guys who had been displaced by the king. And so he gathers them around, literally a band of merry men. He's sort of like Robin Hood of Israel. But he's an outlaw, and Saul has not lost his desire to kill him, and this is when the story gets interesting. And that is why you should read your Bible, because it's amazing, okay? Here's where the story picks up. And Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, and he was told David was in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul is out fighting the Philistines, and the Philistines lived among the Mediterranean Sea, right there next to Judea, right next to what we consider the modern-day Israel. And so they were like the Klingons, right? They were the constant battle back and forth between Israel and the Philistines. And so Saul is returning from a campaign or a battle with the Philistines. His men are tired, and they're bloody, and they're ready to go home, and they're hungry, they've lost friends, and somebody got with Saul. We spotted David and his men, and we think they've got them cornered. So Saul takes 3,000 young men, all from all Israel, and sets out to look for David and his men near the crags of the Wild Goat, which is a large spring, something, in fact, in the Dead Sea, I've never seen Jericho, it looks like that everywhere, but, okay, so here's the Dead Sea. It's just rocks and hills and mountains and caves with some shrub grass, and every once in a while you'll find a spring. So apparently David and his men are at the spring, and Saul knows, and he asks, he thinks this is the opportunity to finally get rid of David. And so Saul and his men came to the sheep pens along the way, and the cave was there, and Saul in the cave to relieve himself. And I realize that's the one time in the scripture you'll ever find the Bible actually says it, but this is describing a real event. And so Saul's in the cave, and Saul and his men, they're going along, and Saul has to go to the bathroom. Okay, so he calls a halt to the whole, all 3,000 men and hundreds of other people that followed him, and he gets off his mule, walks his way up a trail, and path up, and he goes into a cave. While he goes into the cave, all of his army is out there and waits patiently, and if you grew up in church, you know what happens next. David and his men were in the back of the cave hiding, right? And they're all they're in that very cave, and apparently David began to come up behind David and his men. One of David's scouts came and warned David, and Saul has discovered us, and you need to do something. So he said, instead of outnumbering them, let's split up. We'll hide in the cave, and we'll hide in these mountains, and when Saul and his group have passed through, we will reassemble, and we'll go the other way. So David and his closest men are hiding in the very cave, and Saul comes in, totally oblivious to David being in there. Now here's the question, okay? What would you do? Your enemy's there, he's tried to kill you, he's been chasing you around. What would you think you'd do? Well, be honest with you, most of us would go up and take care of Saul. I mean, he's got his back turned to us. I got the knife. Saul's trying to kill me. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm the next king anyway. I'm just going to get rid of this guy. And David might have been tempted to think, well, God put him in my hands. If Saul is a stain, God just provided me the stain remover. Saul's the problem, God gave me the solution. In fact, the men in the cave with David start telling him, you need to go up and kill him, get rid of him. They saw this for exactly what they thought it was. God had delivered your enemy into your hands. And here's what they say. The men with David said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give you the enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. And what they're referring to is David and his men traveled around. They would gather around campfire night, and they were tired, and they were outlaws, and they were poor. They didn't have a place to lay their head, and they left their family in different cities around Judea. It was dangerous. And David would say, be patient, stick with me. One day I'll be king, and if you stick with me until then, when I'm the king, I'll reward you, because someday God is going to honor his promise to me, and I will be king. And so the men around David are saying, are you kidding? This is the day that you spoke of, David. This is the day that you promised. This is the day we've all waited for. And look how God has clearly delivered your enemy in your hands. Imagine what it's going to be like. David, all these men out there, they saw David walk in the caves, and then they will watch David emerge. They'll see Saul go in, and they'll see David come out. Imagine the drama. And David, it would be even better if when you emerged in the cave, you held up Saul's severed head. In that moment, they will pledge their lives to you. In that moment, it will be an almost bloodless coup, and you will be king. And David's sort of caught up in it. And so he starts to sneak up on him. He's fugitive. He's tired of hiding. And the enemy's there. It could be a God thing, right? As David gets caught up in the emotion, he decides to go unto him as he intended to do unto me. Now, I'm going to talk to you about something, then we're going to go back to the story. This is important. If you've been daydreaming or lost interest, wake up. Time to pay attention again. Okay? Look at the root of most causes, most messes. At the root of most messes, associated with most of the messes we make, is a breakdown in virtue. You know what virtue is? At the root of most of our messes, or associated with most of our messes, the ones we married into, the ones we created ourselves, the ones we dated into, the ones we accidentally got ourselves into, at the root of those messes is a breakdown of virtue. Virtue is integrity, it is honesty, it is patience, it is self-control, it is goodness. And when you scratch beneath the surface of any mess that we've made, somewhere in the mess we've demonstrated a lack of virtue. There was a breakdown of virtue. In other words, if you ignore virtue, you will eventually end up in a mess. It's just a matter of time. It's cause and effect. And if it's just an equation, if you ignore virtue in a relationship, you ignore virtue in your finances, you ignore virtue in your profession, like academically, even eventually you're going to end up in a mess. And you don't clean up a failure of virtue with another failure in virtue. You don't clean up a flood by giving more water. You don't clean up a paint spill by painting it. You don't clean up a soap spill with more soap. Two things don't make a right, and two messes don't make an unmess. You can't clean up a mess caused by a failure of virtue with another failure of virtue. Every mess comes with bad options. We've already said that. And those bad options always involve a failure of virtue. And they are the options we are tempted to reach for quick because it looks like I can quickly turn this thing around. The guy who says, well, I'm in debt and I don't know how I'm going to pay my bills, but they won't notice if I take a couple 20s out of the register at work. They won't know if I fix the books a little bit so I got some extra money so that I fudge my timesheet so it makes it look like I worked more so I get paid overtime. You don't clean up a failure of virtue with another failure of virtue because you dig that hole and it gets deeper and deeper, and then you got to tell more lies to cover it and find other ways to take care of it. And that's exactly what David was getting ready to do. David was a warrior. He was a soldier. Text tells us he crept up unnoticed. He was able to creep up behind a King Saul and King Saul out ever knowing it happened. And all he could feel would be a yank on the back of his hair, and that would be the last breath he took. And as he King Saul, something dawns on him. I'm about to lay my hands on God's anointed. I'm about to make my mess messier. I'm about to murder a king. I'm about to assassinate the one God put in office originally. I'm about to kill my father-in-law. I'm about to kill my wife's dad and my children's granddad. What in the world am I thinking? If I murder the king, this will be my story forever. This is where we get trapped. Was that justified? Would he have justified in killing the king? Well, everybody would have said, yes, absolutely. He's trying to kill you. Was that everybody expected him to do, including the friends in the cave? It might have been the popular thing, but it wasn't the virtuous thing. And he was about to add to his story a part of his story that he would be embarrassed to tell for the rest of his life. Granddad, tell us again how you came king. Well, your great-grandfather, and he just walked in the cave, and I couldn't see a thing, and our eyes were just as darkness, and your brave granddaddy, I snuck up behind him and grabbed him by the hair and cut his throat. That's how I became king. David was about to make a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life, even though it was justified, even though it's what everybody was expected, even though it's what arguably Saul deserved. And there we are, and that's our tension. It's our dilemma because every mess comes with the same really bad options. I've misspent my money. And now I'm bankrupt. But instead of admitting I have a problem and trying to get help, I try to cover it up by stealing from the company I work for. I dig the hole deeper, and then I cover it up by lying about it. Maybe I never get caught. But you know what? All I do is make the mess worse. So there we are. So David crept up unnoticed, but instead of killing him, he cuts off a corner of Saul's robe. Then the men were hiding back in the cave couldn't believe what they're seeing as David gets closer and closer, and all of a sudden he stops, reaches over and takes Saul's robe that Saul had discarded, cuts off a corner, and then sneaks back into the cave. And then when he gets back, the text tells us that that bothered his conscience. Just that. The cutting of a corner of Saul's robes bothered him because even doing that was an offense to the king. Attacking anything a king owned was like attacking a king himself. Afterwards, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of the robe. And he said to him, "Men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him who is anointed of the Lord." See, guys, I almost forgot. God put him in place, and I have no business replacing that God put in place. I have no business replacing what God put in place. It's not my responsibility to tell God what belongs in control. I don't want to become king by murdering the king. Well, when he said this, the men around him said, "Well, you may feel bad about it, and we don't feel bad about it. Let's just do it. We don't want his blood on your hands. We would love to have his blood on our hands. We'll do what you're unwilling to do." With those words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And so Saul left the cave and went his way. And if you think that it's been a very good story so far, think it's just been dramatic, what happens next is absolutely mind-blowing. See, somebody needs to make a movie about it just so we can see this scene. Okay, so you're sitting out, and you're sitting out on our donkeys and our mules and our horses in the hot, and oh my gosh, is it hot. And we're right down there in this Dead Sea Valley in the basin, waiting. Finally, King Saul comes out. Nobody makes contact. Nobody pretends like we don't know why we stopped here. Here comes Saul. He's got his robe on, making his way down the hill. Suddenly, somebody comes and gives him two hands and steps up and gets on his mule. And they're about to leave, and David appears in the mouth of the cave that he just came out of. And he says, "Yo-ho, your king." But everybody turns and looks. And then David went out of the cave, and he said to Saul, and Saul turns and over, and he squints, and he says to his young companion, "Is that who I think it is?" And he says, "Yes, your highness, it is your son-in-law, David." And everybody in Saul's army knew immediately what had just happened. Here's what Samuel says about next. David gives a little speech, and here's a little part of the speech. "This day you have seen with your eyes how the Lord delivered me into your hands, king. God brought you, God delivered you to me in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. Not only did I not kill you, I kept other men. I defended you. Saul, I just did for you what your bodyguards standing around you now failed to do. Shame on your bodyguards. I have protected your life in a way they failed to. And I said to them, I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is my Lord's anointed. You may not be acting like the Lord's anointed. You may be a sorry example of what a king should be, but you are the God's anointed, and I am not going to replace what God put in place." And then he says something that some of you listening, and some of you watching, and some of you on some of you listening on live stream, you need to just look and load on this. This is so important. David says, "May the Lord God judge between you and me." May God judge between you and me. I am not your judge. May God judge between you and me. And may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, because you have wronged me. But my hand will not touch you. Now it is David the merciful. His reputation rises. David the merciful. Essentially what David says to Saul and the soldiers, essentially what he communicates to them is simply this: I'm opting for virtue over hurting you. I'm opting for virtue over killing you. I've done something a mere mortal wouldn't do. I've done something that's just not normal. Something that's just not natural. And there's only one reason that happens. It's because my God is in control. What else can Saul do? He's completely humbled. His bodyguard is completely humiliated. His soldiers are in awe of David. And Saul knows at any minute they may just declare David king because they've never seen anything like this. It was completely unheard of in a world of bloodshed where death came easy and life was cheap. So Saul says to David, today it is evident to all of us that you are a better man than me, David. And Saul turns around and heads back to Jerusalem. 7 chapters later, a random Philistine arrow pierces Saul's armor and he dies. And David becomes the king of Israel. This is what I want to make sure you don't miss today. Every mess, every one of them, comes with a pre-packaged list of bad options. Every mess comes pre-packaged with some bad options. And if you choose a bad option, it will make your mess messier. And here's the thing. Again, if you tuned out, you got to hear this part. Okay? It's time to wake up if you're taking a nap. You haven't. Here's the reality. If you can, okay, you see eventually the mess that you're currently experiencing. Eventually, the mess that you're currently in will be reduced to 1 or 2 sentences. The season of your life that you would say this is the most painful, complicated, horrible season of my life, the day will come when the entire season of life can be reduced in 1 or 2 sentences. 5 years ago, I was in the hospital in a coma. 5 years ago, I went through a really terrible divorce. 5 years ago, I had to declare bankruptcy. All the events surrounding bankruptcy, the 1 sentence. 6 weeks ago, I discovered my wife was having an affair. 4 years ago, I got arrested. 2 years ago, I had to drop out of school. 7 or 8 years ago, my wife and I went through a really difficult time and we were separated. See all those giant life events, all those messes, they get reduced to 1 or 2 sentences. But your response to the mess is the true story. The real story isn't your mess. The mess is the mess, and once you're in a mess, it's there. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can't unscramble eggs. You can't go back and relive history. The real story is how you respond. And your response to the mess becomes a permanent part of the story of your life. What brings us to the question I beg you to ask? It's somehow between the friends and King Saul, it dawned on David, what story do I want to tell? Is this honoring my God to kill this man? When people hear that you went through a divorce 4 years ago, what story do you want to tell coming out of that divorce? Well, my wife and I, we fought, and it was the most horrible experience of my life. But I want to tell you that you need to work really hard to protect your marriage. Don't do what I did. Don't get so involved in work that you don't have anything to do with your family. Don't, whatever. What you learned is what you pass on. But that's why you don't try to make it worse by making the mess bigger. What do you want to tell? What did you do as a result of failing school or bankruptcy? Yeah, you got caught. Yeah, you got busted. But what was your response? Because your response to your mess is that's what it becomes, the story, the permanent part of your life. Which of the options do you want as a permanent part of your story? Well, Lord, I'm in debt, and so I'm going to steal from my company. I'm going to embezzle. And you get caught. And it's not just enough to say, well, 5 years ago I was in debt, and I didn't know how I was going to pay my bills. Now it becomes, well, 5 years ago I was in debt, and to cover up that debt, I started stealing. Is that really what you want to be part of the story? You need to learn to take the virtuous option. You know, I went to my boss and told him the truth. I turned myself in. I asked them exactly what I owed them and then took it. Took them. If I took the rest of my life, I would pay it off. I cut up our credit cards. I went to the dean and I apologized and told the dean I would do anything I needed to do if he would let me go back to school. I studied harder than I ever studied before. What options do you want as a permanent part of your record? That's the real story. Because the real story is that you're a mess. Everybody has a mess. It's what we do. It's how we address the mess. It's how we respond. That's the real story. And I guess part of my energy today is that I just don't want any of you to add more water to your flood. I don't want any of you to add more paint to your paint spill. I don't want any of you to make it worse. So don't choose an option that makes you a liar for the rest of your life. Don't choose an option that makes you a liar or an adulterer or a thief. Don't make up a story. Choose virtue. Choose repentance. Don't opt for anything that makes you a liar. Don't opt for anything that makes you a hypocrite. And for some of you, especially students, please don't use someone else's bad behavior as an excuse to behave badly. Please don't use someone else's bad behavior as an excuse. That was David's dilemma. He had every excuse in the world to have slain Saul. But instead, he chose the way of virtue. Look, guys. Don't get into the vote of saying, well, that's my parents are the fault. It's not a matter of an eye for an eye or a tooth for tooth. I opted over virtue over expediency. If you're a Christian, Jesus says, follow me. And he expects you to take the virtuous route. But following him means he doesn't change us instantly. We have to learn to follow him. Follow me and I will lead you out. And if you follow me through your mess, you're going to walk through a whole bunch of options that a whole bunch of people would opt for. And you're going to dodge some options that all your friends are going to say, are you kidding me? It's obviously what you needed to do. Here's what you need to tell her. Here's what you tell him. Here's how you make sure you don't get caught again. Here's how to make sure you can get through that again. And Jesus says, What you need to do is follow me. And I'm going to walk you around a whole lot of bad options. And one day when you talk about your messes, and you sum it up in 2 sentences, when you talk about your response to your mess, you won't have to lie, you won't have to be a hypocrite, but what you can say is, 5 years ago, I went through a really messy divorce. But God walked me through it. God was with me every step of the way. In 2011, I ended up in the hospital in a coma. But my God watched over me every step of the way. I can look back on it now, and it's reduced to 1 or 2 sentences, but it now becomes a God story. My God is bigger than that. My God is able to do that. And I can triumph because of Him. So the question you got to ask yourself is, what story do you want to tell? Which options do you want to include? Wouldn't you much rather to say, I was in a debt and God came to my rescue, instead of me trying to manipulate the situation and save myself? Came to the realization that I had cheated on my wife. And so I went to her and I confessed my sin. And I begged her forgiveness. And it took us a long time, but we worked it out, and now we're back together, and our marriage is even stronger because I opted for God's route. If you're a Christian, you follow the Savior, and that's the way you address